Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the channel. Before 1500, the territory now known as Brazil was inhabited by millions of indigenous peoples, belonging to hundreds of distinct tribes, including the Tupi, Guarani, Yanomami, and many others. These groups spoke diverse languages and developed unique cultures adapted to their specific environments. The Tupi and Guarani were more concentrated along the coast and river basins, while groups like the Yanomami lived deep in the Amazon rainforest. The social structure of these tribes varied significantly. Many indigenous communities were organized into clans or extended family groups, often led by chiefs or elders, who held authority based on their experience, wisdom, or leadership abilities. Decision making in many tribes was collective with a strong emphasis on consensus. In tribes like the Yanomami, egalitarian principles guided daily life, whereas the Tupi and Guarani had more defined roles within their communities. The indigenous economy was based on sustainable use of natural resources. Agriculture was prominent among the Tupi and Guarani, who cultivated crops such as cassava maize and sweet potatoes using slash and burn techniques. They also engaged in hunting, fishing, and gathering wild fruits and nuts to supplement their diets. The Yanomami relied on a combination of hunting, fishing, and small-scale horticulture, with their intimate knowledge of the rainforest ensuring balance with their environment. Trade networks between tribes facilitated the exchange of goods, such as tools, ornaments, and food, fostering cooperation and cultural exchange. Culturally, these societies were rich in oral traditions, rituals, and spiritual beliefs. Many indigenous groups had creation myths and viewed the natural world as imbued with spiritual significance. Rituals often involved music, dance, and storytelling, with shamans playing a vital role as spiritual leaders and healers. Artistic expression was evident in body painting, featherwork, pottery, and carvings, which often carried symbolic meanings tied to their cultural identities and spiritual practices. The arrival of European explorers in the 1500s, led by Pedro Alvarez Cabral, marked the beginning of profound changes for these indigenous peoples. Initial contact brought the introduction of foreign goods, but it also introduced devastating diseases like smallpox and measles, to which indigenous populations had no immunity. These diseases caused massive population declines, disrupting traditional societies. European colonization also led to land dispossession, forced labor, and cultural assimilation. Many tribes were decimated or displaced, and centuries of exploitation followed, significantly altering the cultural and demographic landscape of pre-colonial Brazil. Despite this, indigenous communities have shown remarkable resilience, continuing to preserve their heritage and fight for their rights in modern Brazil. In 1500, Portuguese navigator Pedro Alvarez Cabral arrived on the coast of present-day Brazil, claiming the land for Portugal under the Treaty of Tordesillas. And initially, the Portuguese crown showed little interest in the territory, focusing instead on lucrative trade routes in Asia. Early activity was limited to extracting bristle wood, a valuable resource for its red dye. However, by the 1530s, fearing incursions by other European powers, the Portuguese implemented the captaincy system. This system divided the land into hereditary grants, governed by Portuguese nobles responsible for developing and defending their territories. While most captaincies failed due to poor management and resistance from indigenous peoples, a few, such as Pernambuco and São Vicente, became successful. The development of the sugarcane economy in the 16th century transformed Brazil into an essential part of the Portuguese Empire. Sugar plantations flourished in the fertile lands of the northeastern region, particularly in Pernambuco and Bahia. These plantations required a large labor force, and although indigenous peoples were initially enslaved, their high mortality rates and resistance led to the importation of enslaved Africans. Over the next centuries, millions of Africans were forcibly brought to Brazil, making it the largest importer of enslaved people in the Americas. African labor became the backbone of enslaved people in the Americas. And then the aging economy and enslaved Africans contributed to Brazil's cultural identity through music, dance, religion, and cuisine. Resistance to slavery manifested in revolts, escapes, and the formation of quilombo, such as the famous Palmares, a maroon community that resisted colonial forces for nearly a century. The Jesuits played a critical role in colonizing Brazil's interior by establishing missions to convert indigenous peoples to Christianity. They created reductions, settlements designed to gather and civilize indigenous communities, protect them from enslavement, and incorporate them into colonial society. While the Jesuits opposed indigenous enslavement, their missions often disrupted traditional ways of life and enforced European cultural norms. They were instrumental in spreading Portuguese influence into the interior regions, but faced opposition from colonial authorities and plantation owners. Throughout the colonial period, conflicts with other European powers were a constant threat. In the 16th century, the French attempted to establish colonies, including France, Antarctique near Rio de Janeiro, and France Equinoxiale in Maranhão. Both efforts were ultimately repelled by Portuguese forces. In the 17th century, the Dutch captured parts of northeastern Brazil, including the sugar-rich region of Pernambuco, and held it for decades. Their occupation brought innovations in trade and urban planning, but they were ultimately expelled in 1654 by a coalition of Portuguese forces and local militias. Bandeirantes, groups of Portuguese and mestizo explorers, ventured into Brazil's vast interior during the 17th and 18th centuries, operating from Sao Paulo. They searched for gold, precious stones, and indigenous people to enslave. Their expeditions led to the discovery of gold and diamonds in Minas Gerais, Goiás, and Mato Grosso, sparking a mining boom that shifted the colony's economic center from the northeast to the interior. Bandeirantes also played a critical role in expanding Brazil's borders, often surpassing the boundaries defined by the Treaty of Tordesillas. This territorial expansion laid the groundwork for Brazil's modern borders. By the early 19th century, Brazil had become a vital and diverse colony within the Portuguese Empire, characterized by its sugar plantations, mining economy, and reliance on enslaved labor. The influences of indigenous peoples, Africans and Europeans, shaped its cultural and social fabric, setting the stage for the independence movement that would emerge in 1822. In 1822, Brazil declared its independence from Portugal under the leadership of Dom Pedro I, the son of the Portuguese king. Dom Pedro I, who became Brazil's first emperor, proclaimed independence after growing tensions between the Brazilian elite and the Portuguese government. The establishment of the Brazilian Empire marked the beginning of a constitutional monarchy that sought to unite the vast and diverse country under centralized authority. However, Dom Pedro I faced political challenges, including disputes with regional elites and dissatisfaction with his autocratic tendencies, leading to his abdication in 1831 in favor of his son, Dom Pedro II. Dom Pedro II ascended the throne as a child, and a regency governed until he came of age. His reign, which lasted from 1840 to 1889, was a period of significant economic growth and cultural development. Under his leadership, Brazil transitioned from a sugar-based economy to one dominated by coffee production. The coffee boom, particularly in the southeastern regions of Sao Paulo, Minas Gerais, and Rio de Janeiro, became the backbone of Brazil's economy, and attracted European immigrants, including Italians, Germans, and Portuguese, to work on plantations. These immigrants contributed to the modernization of agricultural practices and the diversification of Brazilian society. And pointing to geography, the abolition of slavery was one of the most defining events of this period. By the mid-19th century, Brazil had become the largest slaveholding society in the world, with millions of enslaved Africans contributing to its economic prosperity. Pressure from abolitionist movements, both domestic and international, led to gradual steps toward emancipation, including the Lei do Ventre Livre, 1871, which freed the children of enslaved mothers, and the Lei dos Sexagenarios, 1885, which freed enslaved individuals over 60 years old. Finally, in 1888, Princess Isabel, active in closing an apprenticeship rule for Golden Law, which abolished slavery entirely. This decision, while morally significant, disrupted the plantation economy and alienated the powerful landowning elite who felt betrayed by the monarchy. Social and political unrest grew during the late 19th century as tensions between the monarchy and various factions, including military leaders, Republicans, and discontented elites, intensified. Economic challenges combined with dissatisfaction over the monarchy's inability to address regional inequalities and political reform fueled calls for change. In 1889, a military coup led by Republican forces ended the Brazilian Empire and established the first Brazilian republic, marking the transition from monarchy to a new era of governance. The fall of the monarchy signaled the end of an era and the beginning of a new chapter in Brazil's history as a republic. In 1889, the Brazilian Empire came to an end with the proclamation of the republic through a military coup led by Marshal Deodoro da Fonseca. The monarchy was replaced by a federal republic, and a new constitution was adopted in 1891. The early years of the first Brazilian Republic were heavily influenced by the military, with Marshal Deodoro and Marshal Floriano Peixoto serving as the first two presidents. This period marked a shift from centralized monarchy to decentralized governance with significant power granted to state governments. Oligarchic politics dominated this era, particularly through the café cum leite system, a political arrangement in which power alternated between the coffee-producing elites of Sao Paulo and the cattle-raising elites of Minas Gerais. This system ensured the dominance of the rural oligarchy while marginalizing urban populations and smaller states. Elections were often manipulated and political corruption was rampant, with limited participation for most Brazilians, including women, the poor, and recently freed Afro-Brazilians. Despite its oligarchic nature, the First Republic saw significant industrialization and urbanization in major cities like Sao Paulo, Rio de Janeiro, and Belo Horizonte. Coffee exports continued to drive the economy, but investments in industries such as textiles, steel, and transportation began to diversify Brazil's economic base. Railroads expanded, connecting coffee plantations to ports, while urban centers grew rapidly, attracting both domestic migrants and European immigrants. This urban growth brought modernization, but also deepened social inequalities. The rise of social movements and labor strikes during this period reflected the growing unrest among urban workers and rural peasants. Harsh working, getting them, conditions in factories and on plantations, coupled with low wages and lack of labor rights, led to the emergence of organized labor movements. Strikes became more frequent, with workers demanding better conditions, shorter working hours, and higher wages. Anarchist and socialist ideas gained traction among workers, particularly in urban centers. Rural unrest also emerged, exemplified by movements like the Canudos Rebellion 1896, 1897, and the Contestado War 1916, which highlighted the struggles of marginalized communities against the inequalities of the Republic. By the late 1920s, dissatisfaction with the oligarchic system and growing calls for political and social reforms created the conditions for change. Economic instability, including the decline of coffee prices on the global market, further weakened the First Republic, paving the way for the 1930 revolution that would bring Getulio Vargas to power and mark the end of this political era. In 1930, Getulio Vargas came to power following the Revolution of 1930, which marked the end of the First Brazilian Republic. Dissatisfied with the dominance of the café cum leite system and widespread corruption, political and military factions overthrew the government, ushering in a new era under Vargas. Initially ruling as a provisional president, Vargas implemented sweeping changes aimed at centralizing power and modernizing Brazil's economy and society. By 1937, Vargas established the Estado Novo, an authoritarian regime characterized by the suspension of the Constitution, the dissolution of Congress, and the centralization of political authority. Vargas justified these measures by claiming they were necessary to prevent a communist uprising and maintain national stability. During this period, censorship, political repression, and the suppression of opposition became hallmarks of his government. The Estado Novo also promoted a nationalist agenda, emphasizing Brazilian identity and unity. Economic modernization and industrialization were central to Vargas's policies. His government invested heavily in infrastructure, created state-owned enterprises, and encouraged the development of key industries such as steel, oil, and energy. The establishment of Companhia Siderúrgica National and Petrobras marked significant steps toward reducing Brazil's dependence on foreign imports. Vargas's policies aimed to diversify the economy and promote urban development, laying the groundwork for Brazil's transformation into a modern industrial state. Vargas also implemented labor reforms and populist policies that earned him widespread support among workers. He established labor laws that regulated working hours, mandated paid vacations, and introduced social security benefits. Workers' rights were institutionalized through the creation of the Ministry of Labor, and unions were brought under state control to prevent unrest. Vargas's populist rhetoric and support for the working class earned him the nickname Father of the Poor, although his labor policies also served to strengthen his political control. During World War II, Brazil played a significant role on the global stage. Initially maintaining neutrality, Vargas eventually aligned Brazil with the Allies. In 1942, after German U-boats attacked Brazilian ships, Brazil contributed to the war effort by providing raw materials, military bases, and troops. The Brazilian Expeditionary Force, FEB, was sent to fight in Italy, marking the war effort boosted Brazil's economy, accelerated industrialization, and increased its geopolitical importance. By the end of the war in 1945, pressures for democratization and dissatisfaction with Vargas's authoritarian rule led to his ousting by the military. The Vargas era had a profound impact on Brazil, shaping its political, economic, and social landscape for decades to come. After the end of World War II, Brazil returned to democracy in 1945 with the ousting of Getúlio Vargas. A new constitution was adopted, and the country saw the election of President Eurico Gaspar Dutra. However, the post-war period was marked by political instability, with frequent changes in leadership, economic challenges, and social unrest. The era was characterized by political polarization between left-wing groups, including communal leaders like Gaspar, conservative forces leading to constant tension. In 1964, this instability culminated in a military coup that ousted President João Goulart, a left-wing politician who had been advocating for progressive reforms, including land redistribution and the expansion of workers' rights. The coup was supported by conservative forces, leading to constant tension. In 1964, this instability culminated in a military coup that ousted President João Goulart, a left-wing politician who had states which feared the spread of communism in Latin America. The military establishment took control, instituting a dictatorship that lasted until 1985. The new regime suspended the constitution, dissolved Congress, and implemented strict censorship and repression. During the dictatorship, the military regime pursued an economic strategies that focused on rapid industrialization and economic growth, known as the Brazilian Miracle, 1968-1973. This period saw impressive GDP growth, the expansion of infrastructure, and the modernization of industries. Foreign investment flowed into Brazil, and the country became one of the world's fastest-growing economies. However, the economic boom came at the cost of social inequality, environmental degradation, and rising public debt. While some sectors of society benefited from the growth, many Brazilians, especially the poor, saw little improvement in their standard of living. The military regime was characterized by widespread human rights violations, including the use of torture, arbitrary detention, and the forced disappearance of political opponents. Thousands of activists, intellectuals, and ordinary citizens were persecuted for their real or perceived opposition to the regime. Resistance to the dictatorship grew over time, and underground movements began to form, including left-wing guerrilla groups and urban opposition networks. The government's use of repression intensified, especially in the 1970s, when the regime sought to silence all forms of dissent. Despite the harsh repression, opposition movements, labor unions, and civil society groups began to play an increasingly prominent role in challenging the dictatorship. Workers' strike, student protests, and opposition political parties, particularly those led by former political exiles, gained momentum. Labor unions such as the United Workers Central Única dos Trabajadores, became important centers of resistance, advocating for workers' rights and demanding political freedoms. By the late 1970s and early 1980s, economic problems such as hyperinflation, rising unemployment, and a growing national debt weakened the military regime's grip on power. In 1985, under increasing pressure from pro-democracy movements and mounting popular unrest, the military agreed to transition to a civilian government, ending 21 years of authoritarian rule. The end of the dictatorship marked the beginning of Brazil's return to democracy with the election of a civilian president, Tancredo Neves, who was set to take office but died before his inauguration, and transitioned to a civilian government, ending 21 years of authoritarian rule, the end of the dictatorship, and ushering in a new democratic era. In 1985, Brazil transitioned from a military dictatorship to a civilian government, marking the beginning of the re-democratization process. The end of military rule came after increasing pressure from opposition movements, including labor unions, student groups, and political activists. The transition was formalized with the election of Tancredo Neves as president in 1985, although he passed away before assuming office, and his vice president, José Sarney, took power. Sarney's presidency was marked by efforts to stabilize the country after years of military rule, but the economy faced major challenges, including high inflation and economic instability. In 1988, Brazil adopted a new democratic constitution, which replaced the 1967 constitution that had been imposed during the military dictatorship. The 1988 constitution, often referred to as the Citizen Constitution, established a more inclusive political framework, guaranteeing civil liberties, human rights, and expanded social rights. It also decentralized power, devolving significant authority to state and municipal governments. This marked the consolidation of democracy in Brazil after 2 decades of authoritarian rule. However, Brazil's economic struggles continued into the 1990s with chronic hyperinflation and a volatile currency undermining the country's economic stability. In the early 1990s, under President Fernando Collor de Mello, the government implemented controversial measures such as freezing bank accounts in an effort to curb inflation. While Collor's administration faced economic challenges, it also faced significant corruption scandals, leading to his impeachment in 1992. The 1990s also saw Brazil embark on economic reforms under President Fernando Henrique Cardoso, who took office in 1995. Cardoso, an economist, spearheaded a series of measures aimed at stabilizing the Brazilian economy, including the introduction of the Real Plan in 1994, which pegged the Brazilian real to the US dollar and significantly reduced inflation. This economic stabilization paved the way for growth and reduced poverty during the late 1990s and early 2000s. The grand credit spread. The 2000s were marked by strong economic growth under the presidency of Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, who served from 2003 to 2011. Lula, a former union leader, focused on reducing poverty and inequality through social programs such as Bolsa Familia, a conditional cash transfer program aimed at supporting low-income families. These programs helped lift millions of Brazilians out of poverty and contributed to Brazil's growing global influence. Lula's government also benefited from rising global commodity prices, which bolstered Brazil's economy. However, the 2000s also saw the rise of political scandals. The Mensalão scandal involving the bribery of members of Congress rocked Lula's government and tarnished his presidency. Despite the scandal, Lula remained highly popular, leaving office in 2011 with high approval ratings. His successor, Dilma Rousseff, continued many of his policies, but her presidency faced increasing economic difficulty, including a slowdown in growth and rising inflation. In 2016, Rousseff was impeached and removed from office over accusations of fiscal mismanagement, marking a period of political instability. The 2010s saw the eruption of another major political scandal, Lava Jato, Operation Car Wash, which was a massive corruption investigation targeting the state oil company Petrobras and leading to the exposure of widespread corruption involving political elites and business leaders across multiple parties. And this investigation further eroded trust in political institutions and led to the jailing of former President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, who was convicted on corruption charges, though his sentence was later annulled. The political climate in Brazil became increasingly polarized in the 2010s, with the rise of Jair Bolsonaro, a far-right politician who was elected in 2018. Bolsonaro's presidency has been marked by controversy, including his handling of the COVID-19 pandemic, which has drawn criticism for downplaying the virus and opposing lockdowns and mask mandates. Bolsonaro's policies and rhetoric have led to heightened divisions within Brazilian society, with significant protests both in support and opposition to his government. Recent years have seen a country grappling with deepening political polarization, economic challenges, environmental concerns, and the ongoing fight against corruption. Despite these challenges, Brazil remains one of the largest economies in the world, with a vibrant cultural scene and an influential role in Latin America and beyond. Brazil's cultural identity has evolved over centuries, shaped by a blend of indigenous African and European influences. This rich and diverse heritage is reflected in its music, literature, art, and social movements, which have played significant roles in shaping the country's identity and global reputation. Music has been a central element in Brazilian culture. Samba, a genre with African roots, emerged in the early 20th century, particularly in the favelas of Rio de Janeiro, and became a symbol of Brazil's national identity. Samba is deeply intertwined with Carnival, the country's most famous festival, which is characterized by vibrant parades, music, and dancing. Bossa Nova, a more refined and jazzy style, emerged in the late 1950s, blending samba with jazz and gaining international acclaim through artists like João Gilberto and Antonio Carlos Jobim. These musical movements not only shaped Brazilian cultural life, but also influenced the global music scene, with bossa nova in particular becoming a worldwide phenomenon. Brazilian literature and art have also contributed to the country's cultural identity. The literary movement of modernism, which began in the 1920s, sought to break away from colonial and European traditions, focusing on national themes and local folklore. Writers such as Mario de Andrade and Oswald de Andrade explored Brazil's diverse cultural roots, giving voice to its unique social fabric. In visual arts, Brazil produced world-renowned artists like Tarsila do Amaral, whose modernist works celebrated Brazilian identity, and Candido Portinari, whose murals depicted the lives of the working class and rural peasants. Football plays a central role in shaping Brazil's national identity and is considered more than just a sport. Since the early 20th century, Brazil's success in international competitions, particularly the World Cup, has become a source of national pride. The country's 5 World Cup victories, 1, 9, 5, 8, 1, 9, 6, 2, 1, 9, 9, 4, and 2002, solidified Brazil's reputation as a football powerhouse. Football has transcended the playing field, uniting the diverse population of Brazil and giving the nation a sense of collective pride. Players like Pele, Zico, Romario, Ronaldo, and more recently Neymar have become national icons, symbolizing Brazil's passion and global prominence in the sport. Brazil's racial diversity is one of its defining characteristics. The African diaspora has played a crucial role in shaping Brazil's cultural and social landscape, particularly through music, dance, cuisine, and religion. Afro-Brazilian contributions have enriched the nation's identity, yet they are also intertwined with the history of slavery, which lasted until 1888. Despite significant contributions, Afro-Brazilians have faced systemic racism and social inequality. In recent decades, movements such as the Black Consciousness Movement, Movimento Negro, have sought to address these inequalities, advocating for greater representation and rights for Afro-Brazilians in all areas of society, including education, politics, and employment. The rise of Afro-Brazilian culture and its acceptance in mainstream society is seen in popular music, television, and public celebrations, yet racial inequality remains a significant issue. Indigenous communities in Brazil, although diminished in numbers due to centuries of colonization, continue to play a vital role in the nation's cultural and environmental life. Indigenous peoples have long fought for recognition rights and the preservation of their ancestral lands, which are rich in biodiversity. Their connection to the environment has led to activism and advocacy for environmental conservation, particularly in the Amazon rainforest. Indigenous movements, particularly in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, have pushed for land rights, better healthcare and education, while also warning of the dangers of deforestation and exploitation of natural resources. These movements have brought global attention to environmental issues and the importance of protecting indigenous cultures and territories. Through these cultural and social aspects, Brazil's history is a story of immense diversity, struggle, and resilience. From music and football to racial equality and environmental conservation, Brazil continues to shape its identity as a nation of contrasts, balancing modernity with tradition and continuing to evolve on the world stage. Hmm. Thank you for watching this video.